To close out this week, I wanted to take a look at a few examples of where kinematics are being applied right now in both clinical and performance settings, and also give you a little bit of a taste of some of the kinematics-related technologies that you might see coming into broader use in the next 5 or 10 years of your career. So first off, I want to start with the example of knee joint angles during vertical jumps and during box jumps, with the motivation being to identify people at risk for ACL tears. So there's been some really great research that uses motion capture technology, which you can use, you can see the cameras right here, and retroreflective markers, which you can see on the body of this athlete, to try to predict which athletes are likely to sustain an ACL ligament tear during, say, soccer, basketball, volleyball. And it turns out one of the important risk factors seems to be knee internal rotation and adduction during drop jumps and vertical jumps. So let me write that down. Knee internal rotation. And really, let's say thigh or femur internal rotation and adduction. The mechanics we're interested in happen at the knee, or are apparent at the knee, but we'll see they're caused by motion at the hip. So this athlete right here is showing actually quite limited internal rotation and adduction, which is great to see from an injury perspective. This is one of those ideas that has actually permeated out into the broader sports performance community, which is great to see. What's interesting, or what's relevant from an injury perspective risk, is that people who, if they land from a drop jump or if they're doing a vertical jump, whose knees come in more like this, seem to be at a greater risk of ACL tear. And likewise, people's let's think about what kinematic angle is causing that sort of knock-kneed posture. It would be an adduction of about the hip joint, right? Because the thigh segment is moving more towards the center line of the body. The other thing that happens that seems to happen in people who are at a greater risk of injury is that they not only adduct, but they also internally rotate the thigh. So that will also have the effect of making the knees sort of point more towards each other. So this is a relatively simple thing, although to get quantitative measurements on it, you need to use motion capture cameras. And it's been pretty cool to see this start being used in clinical research and clinical practice. Number one, to identify people who are at risk for ACL tears, but maybe more importantly, to develop strength training protocols to get people to jump and land without doing this and reduce their risk of an ACL tear. So that's one application that uses the technologies that we've seen already. Another cool one that I wanted to show you is this is more in the domain of ergonomics, which is sort of like how, if you're watching this video and your neck's stooped down and your shoulders are turned up a weird way. You do that too long, you might have neck or back or shoulder problems. So this was some work that was done at the Mayo Clinic that used a really cool wearable technology strategy. So this is one of the things that you might see coming out into your field of practice in the next 5 or 10 years. This wearable tech stuff. So normally, if you were doing, in the ACL stuff, we had cameras and retroreflective markers because what we needed to do to measure, say, the orientation of the knee joint is we needed to measure what's the orientation of the thigh and what's the orientation of the tibia, and also the orientation of the pelvis, right? Well, one thing you can do today, thanks to technological advancements, is put these little devices onto different segments of the body. And by measuring the orientation of the device, which it uses acceleration, angular rotation, and the orientation of gravity to do that. You can measure kinematics outside of the lab, meaning just with these devices alone. So this study was looking at when surgeons are doing surgery, how much time do they spend with their neck, with their shoulder, with their torso in a position that might cause damage, right? So too much time with your arm up here cause shoulder problems, too much time with your neck down in this area, you can get neck problems, you lean over for too long, you get back problems. So this is a really cool application of this new wearable technology approach to use kinematics to help prevent musculoskeletal problems. Another wearable technology approach that has come out recently that I thought was really cool was, again, this is a more ergonomics thing, was looking at back angles for factory workers. So the idea is, say you work for UPS or Amazon, you're moving packages from down here to up here, you bend over a lot. Which orientations of your body put the most stress on your back? Well, that's likely going to be, to a large degree, a function of what's your hip angle, what's your lumbar spine angle, what's your knee angle. So this wearable technology stuff, just keep an eye out for it. I imagine maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, it will be permeating into physical therapy clinics, sports performance settings. And it can be useful for measuring kinematics out in the real world. Something that you will see that exists today is doing kinematics with video. So if you just want a 2D picture of what's going on with, say, some athlete, you can take a video and you can just draw on it either by hand or with, of course, there's a bunch of apps to do it now. You can draw, say, segment angles that you care about. I actually picked this picture because it's a bad example, but I have a good one down here, and we talked about this already. If you had plenty of free software out there, I use a program called Kinovia, free, you can just download it. You can just define, say, okay, I'm going to define the torsos going from the shoulder to the hip joint, define the thighs going from the hip joint to the knee, measure this angle, and you can get a two-dimensional hip flexion angle. It can be very useful. Now, I think these technologies are really exciting. I want to give you, and in fact, I'm so excited about them, I want to warn you about where they can go wrong. And I picked this image because it is one of those examples. I want to make the case to you that this picture is not going to tell you something very useful. And the reason is perspective. If you are doing this, if you're taking a video of a client doing a squat, if you are trying to take video of somebody walking and you want to look at, say, is their pelvis tilting to one side or another, it's very important that you get what we would call, let's say, an orthogonal view. Meaning, in the technical terms we've learned in this class, you want your camera aligned with the plane of motion that you care about. So in the squat, generally, we're interested, well, sometimes we're interested in the sagittal plane motion, right? So what you want is, if the sagittal plane is like this, you want your camera to be facing directly at the sagittal plane. The problem with this picture is that the sagittal plane is oriented like this, and you can tell because you can see this part of the barbell and this part of the barbell. And the camera is at an angle. It's easy to tell that because you can look at rectangular, by the way, here's a useful way to figure out if the camera angle is good. Look at rectangular things in the background, and if things are angled like this, that's not so good. You want the ground to be flat, and you want to be looking sort of head on at the plane of motion you care about. This is a good example. This is one where you could get some useful insights about, say, what's the knee flexion angle right here. The other issue to be aware of, this is less of an issue for, say, like full body weightlifting motion, but the other problem to be aware of if you're using a camera to get kinematics is something called lens distortion. And you may be familiar with this, but you don't know the name for it. If you're taking a selfie and you have your camera too close to you, you get this really weird distortion. So what you'll find is that if you are even if you have your camera head on, if it's too close to the thing you're taking a picture of, the grid line, like if you drew a rectangular grid in the photo, the grid lines would be like distorted, like this. And that would mess up your kinematics as well. The trick for this is just back up, have your camera further away. You want the camera kind of, let's say kind of far. This is less of an issue than the perspective stuff, but I wanted to mention it. Again, this is a great example. You could load this into, say, Canovia and do some joint angle orientation stuff, and it would work out great. The other technology I want to just point out, because this is becoming more popular now, is something called markerless motion capture. And the idea is to hopefully try to do this, but without the reflective markers, because they're kind of a pain to put on. So there is some research going on that that's really cool, and that's going, I think, pretty well in terms of how high quality and accurate it is. But there's also, unfortunately, some systems that are not so good, and I picked this example because it's an example of that. I think this is some squatting app that's supposed to tell you what your joint angles and stuff are. But quite clearly, you can see that this is not where the hip joint is. This is not where the knee joint is. And that's not even where the ankle joint is. So I want to point this out just so that you can be aware that don't trust numbers that you see just because it came out of some software program or some app. I'm hopeful that in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll be able to do stuff like this with athletes in the field, with people in the clinic, and you'll be able to get the kind of data that I can get in the research lab during, in this example, a track meet, or during a soccer game, during a football game, when somebody's just walking down the hallway in your clinic. So hopefully you enjoyed this little applied view of kinematics and have some ideas on how you might be able to use this in clinical performance settings in the future.